The reason for my presence here, on an occasion which commemorates the Canadian scholar whose name has been given to this college, lies, I suppose, in the connection which some have perceived between his theories of communication and certain studies of my own, pursued in the field of classical antiquity. It is a connection ideological rather than personal. Nevertheless, I would like to permit myself a few recollections of the man himself as he existed, that is the word which I think does him justice, in a period of Canadian history of which I too was a small part, subject to the qualification that I was only on the edge of his acquaintance, not one of the close circle of his friends. Innis, the economist, the historian of his country's transportation system, thank you, and industries of staple production, acquired by his writings as soon as they were published, an assured place among his professional peers. It is not part of my task or my competence to deal with this period of his scholarship. Innis, the theorist, the philosopher of history, has had to wait for that kind of appreciation which comes with the passage of time and the emergence of new generations of scholars, of one of the most conspicuous being my neighbor to the right. Was this later Innis the more important Innis? J.B. Brebner's appreciation, which appeared 18 months after Innis's death, gave an early signal that this might be so. He wrote of his novel and complex third and last phase, occupied by, quoting again, obsessive inquiry and thought about the whole history of communications in relation to politico-economic power. He described him as he plunged into the daring and solitary adventure of learning enough about changing modes and patterns of communication in their relation to economics and politics across recorded time to obtain a working hypothesis. Such investigation would be a necessary antidote, I'm quoting Brebner again, to the cult of the present that was inherent in the economics and politics of modern communications monopolies and was robbing political man of his roots in experience and thereby of his good sense. Thirsty work, this lecturing. This early appreciation stands on its own. I know nothing quite like it. It is to a further analysis of this Innis that I address myself 25 years later. The advantage, and of course the danger, of dealing with someone dead at a comfortable interval after his death is that you can do what you like with him. An interpreter has his own preoccupations, and their bias inevitably intrudes into any account he may give of the original. Some have discerned a sympathy between Innis's later thought and certain investigations of my own, and before he died, he discerned it himself. In the light of that sympathy, I undertake this task. To a degree, he evades scrutiny. His later style is aphoristic and disconnected. It slips between the conclusions that his interpreter would wish to formulate. He hungrily reads and obsessively excerpts a vast mass of historical source material, some primary, most of it secondary, frequently repeating himself from paper to paper and book to book. In order to support that working hypothesis, or more correctly, a series of such, to which Brebner refers, he did this. And what he wrote in this vein remains hard reading and always will. I offer to sort it out into a series of related theses, forming an intellectual program, which in his published works he never overtly proposed or explicitly stated, but which I think can be elicited from the multifarious materials exposed in his writings. Many separate things, I shall say, have been said by others, including my colleague, but they have not been put together. First of all, then, one, Innis is a political economist with equal stress on both terms. One detects an aversion to treating economics as an autonomous science. It is either a branch of politics or the servant of politics. Economic structures represent the effects of political decisions. But equally, political structures are conditioned by economic behavior. His theories of communication assume this interdependence. At times, Innis even shows signs of going so far as to treat economic science as a branch of moral science, of morality. Secondly, within this intellectual framework, Innis views the subject matter of political economy as dealing with the ways in which power is exercised by human governments within cultures that are governed. The reality of power is seen in its effects as these register themselves in control over areas of space and periods of time. Empires, as they extend themselves, carry corresponding economic systems and cultures with them. The success won by their extension is to be measured in terms not only of spatial territory, but temporal duration. The Byzantine Empire, for example, so Innis might have argued, though he did not, might by this measure be estimated to have been much more successful than the British. There is something here in the dispassionate way in which Innis looks on history and human motivation, which recalls the outlook of the Greek historian Thucydides. I am not arguing for any influence of one on the other. Third, the proper objective of such systems of culture, I call them that because Innis sometimes seems to regard them as economic systems, sometimes as political structures with a common government, sometimes as peoples sharing a common language. The proper objective is to maintain a balance or equilibrium between space control and time control. If either objective is allowed to dominate over the other, dissolution of power follows. The historical process over the millennia of recorded history can be viewed as a continuing dialectic between the demands of space and those of time, in which civilizations mature as they achieve an equilibrium between the two and dissolve into new forms as the balance is dissolved. It is not always easy to perceive in his writings how this principle works out in practice. In applying it to Antiquity, as in his problem of space, it would seem to imply that space control is generally speaking in the province of the secular and military arm of a culture. Time control is in the keeping of its oral tradition and its religious institutions. As one example, he makes ingenious use of the Babylonian cultural situation as one which functioned in a tension between the political organization of the conquerors, employing a Semitic language exercised over space, and the language and the writings of the conquered, which retained the Sumerian language and control over time. The spread of the printed word in modern times he seems to associate with power over space, exercised at the expense of time, and leading to instability. But he does not make this clear, and perhaps cannot, whether there exists any support for time outside the realm of orality and religion. The doctrine of evolution and the time perspective it would offer on the human condition, what some have called the evolutionary epic, he does not consider. Fourthly, accordingly, in the present epoch, the balance is shifting in favor of space, despite his theoretic adherence to the concept of equilibrium. Innis's later writings betray an increasing concern to make what he calls in one paper a plea for time. He does not plead for space. The time in question is time past and time future, not time now. To explore and seek to understand the political processes of the past is also to learn some control over their future. Retrospection breeds also prediction. Very Thucydidean, that. Our present culture grows hostile to history and, preoccupied with the extension of spatial power, grows indifferent to the future. In Innis's writings, one sees this pessimistic judgment at work, particularly in his later polemics against the United States. One should also note, in the more restricted field of economic theory, where I tread with hesitation, a preference he seems to express, if I'm right, for diachronic over synchronic methods of measurement. The econometrics, which was coming into fashion before he died, and prevails still at Harvard, was for him an exercise in the analysis of a supposedly static and permanent system of relations which, viewed in the light of the dialectical historical process, was bound to prove ephemeral. Fifth, the power to control space and time, which means political power, operates by using technology. The shape of the technology conditions the way in which the power is exercised. As technologies change, so also do the configurations of societies. This principle is implicit in most of his writings. As one explicit example among many, he cites the replacement of bronze by iron and of the cart by the chariot after 1200 BC, as it affected previous equilibrium in Near Eastern empires. Sixth, of all the technologies observable at work in the historical process, it is the technology of communication which is paramount in its control over the political process, that is, over space and time. Communication is to be understood, in the first instance, as the material means used for the physical movement of goods and people and their exchange. Roads, rivers, canals, railways, and the vehicles that ride them, and the money they spend. Whereas current economic and political theory has tended to emphasize the mode and means of production of goods as paramount in determining the social structure, I detect in Innis a preference for viewing their distribution through communication systems as a separable determining factor and one of overriding importance. Seventh, however, paramount over all systems of material communication, the rivers, roads, railways, wagons, automobiles, canoes, ships that bring people together, is that communication achieved through human speech. This is not a matter of mere converse between individuals. Language is a social activity, and political and cultural systems become effective through its management. More precisely, through the methods by which language is recorded and disseminated. These can be traced historically from the clay tablets of Sumeria to the roller printing press, beyond that to the broadcasting of spoken speech through the radio. It is the historian's business to examine these technologies of communication, classifying them by the materials used and the distribution methods employed. For as these vary, so does the political management of space and time vary. Putting it another way, the particular technology in any one period which is used to further communication will produce its own kind of bias in the way in which the communication is applied, and therefore in the kind of content that is expressed. 8. To his review of what might be called the communications industry, as it has developed in the cultures and civilizations of historical record, Innis then added a bias of his own. The orally spoken word, as it is interchanged between persons, possesses certain virtues denied to the written version. It reports experience more expressively, its effects are more flexible and tentative, It avoids the dogmatism of a fixed statement. By leaving some things unexpressed, it leaves the way open for further exploration. It avoids fixed positions. As for the oral tradition, he says that it implies the spirit, whereas writing and printing are inherently materialistic. This arrangement of Innis's thought that I've offered you is, I must remind you, my own.
It corresponds to those hemispheres behind you.
I thought you'd spot that. It would be a just tribute to his cautious temper to say that the theses I have distinguished represent merely areas of inquiry which require urgent investigation without raising logical or epistemological questions about their relative priorities. Working within this intellectual framework, Innis surveyed the technologies of communication of antiquity, the materials employed: stone surface, clay tablet, wooden plaque, papyrus, parchment, the instruments applied to the material: chisel, stylus, brush, pen, methods of storing and consulting what was written in private houses, public libraries, bookstores. He observed the crucial importance of the invention of paper manufacture imported from China, which entered into partnership with the printing press to produce the printed book. Turning to his own era, with which we conveniently label the modern, he noted the unprecedented escalation of communications technology through the invention of the telegraph, the roller printing press, mass production of newsprint and of newspapers, all of this capped by the emergence of radio and television, to which, however, he was able to give only minimal attention before he died. Could we say that Marshall McLuhan took up here where Innis stopped? The raw data of these matters are scattered through Innis's writings, always attached to his observation of the social and political effects, particularly to the varying degrees of monopoly to which varying technologies at varying times lend themselves. And finally, he noted, and this is where his work touches closely on my own, the changes in the technology of writing itself, in which he seems to recognize an unusually crucial role played by the invention of the Greek alphabet. As he brings his survey into the 19th and 20th centuries, one detects an underlying vein of pessimism. As invention has increased the rapidity with which information is processed for consumption and multiplied in its amount, the mind of modern man becomes preoccupied with instantaneous experience at the expense of long-range calculation and memory. It is being deluged with the ephemeral at the expense of retrospection over the past and forethought for the future. He writes in the strategy of culture as follows: the overwhelming pressure of mechanization, evident in the newspaper and the magazine, has led to the creation of vast monopolies of communication. Their entrenched positions involve a continuous, systematic, ruthless destruction of elements of permanence essential to cultural activity. For him, the mass media are not ushering in any brave new world. In terms of the historical dialectic, the necessary balance between control of space and control over time is being destroyed. This conclusion colors a great deal of what he says about the United States and its history, observing in the first instance, quite analytically, without judging anything, the way in which, for example, Andrew Jackson and his followers established media to maintain a close contact with the voters. After his election, the United States Telegraph and the Washington Globe became administrative mouthpieces. Then he notes how in the Civil War, the North, lacking able generals, was compelled, I quote, to build up the effectiveness of a widely separated staff with activities coordinated through the telegraph. Or how again, Cleveland, I quote, gave out messages on Sunday evenings to get more space in the Monday papers, a technique improved upon by Theodore Roosevelt. He observes that for Franklin Roosevelt, on the other hand, through the further technology of the radio, words were managed no longer for print to be read, but for the airwaves to be heard. I quote, "It is significant that before the radio, no preeminent orator ever succeeded in reaching the presidency." Possibly he is thinking here in particular of Daniel Webster. These, I repeat, are analytic observations, but the effects produced from the observed facts can also be submitted to a value judgment placed upon them, and he does this. Noting the protection which the American Constitution seeks to give to the individual against the majority, he adds this: "But the extent of such protection has varied and declined with improvements in the technology of communication and the increasing powers of the executive, as Senator McCarthy has conspicuously shown." The same pessimism extends itself to his view of Canadian-American relations, and for the same reason. I quote, the jackals of communication systems are constantly on the alert to destroy every vestige of sentiment toward Great Britain, holding it of no advantage if it threatens the omnipotence of American commercialism. This is to strike at the heart of cultural life in Canada.